He had stood at that gate for 11 years. 11 years of the same black boots, the same bearskin hat, the same stone face. Thousands of tourists had photographed him. Hundreds had tried to make him laugh. A few had cried in front of him, thinking he couldn't see. But nobody, not one single person in 11 years, had called him by his real name. Not James. Not Jimmy. Not even Mate. Just the guard. And the strange thing? He had stopped expecting anything different. That was the part that stayed with me long after I walked away from Buckingham Palace that afternoon. Not what happened, but the look on his face when it finally did. It was a Tuesday in late October. I know that because I just come off a horrible Monday, the kind where everything goes slightly wrong, but nothing goes catastrophically wrong, which almost makes it worse. A friend had suggested I take a walk through St. James's Park to clear my head. I live about 20 minutes from the palace on a good day, and I've walked past the gates probably 100 times in my life. You stop really seeing it after a while. It just becomes background like a lamppost or a bus stop. That Tuesday, though, something made me slow down. Maybe it was the light. October in London does this thing where the sun drops low and turns everything amber, and for about 40 minutes in the afternoon, the whole city looks like a photograph from another era. The palace gates were glowing. The tourists were gathered in their usual clusters, a school group from somewhere in Germany, a few American couples with enormous cameras, some locals like me who were just passing through and got pulled in by the crowd. There were two guards visible from the main gate. One was pacing slowly along his short stretch of gravel, his steps perfectly measured, his gaze fixed at some point in the middle distance that didn't seem to exist in this world. The other, the one this story is actually about, was standing completely still at the left post. Completely still. Not in the way a statue is still. In the way a person is still when they've trained themselves to be. There's a difference if you know how to look. A statue has no weight behind it. This man had weight. You could feel it somehow, even from 20 feet away, through the iron fence. His name, I would later find out, was James Whitfield, 34 years old, from a small town in Shropshire, the kind of town where everybody knows your surname and uses it constantly. He had joined the Coldstream Guards at 18. He had done 2 tours abroad. He had come back quieter than he left, the way men sometimes do, and had eventually ended up here at this gate, in this uniform, doing this job. He was good at the job. Very good. That was the thing about James. He was so good at disappearing into the role that even the people who worked alongside him sometimes forgot the person underneath the uniform. I didn't know any of this standing at the gate that afternoon. I just saw a guard, a very still, very composed man in a bearskin hat, doing his duty in the amber October light. Then the school group moved closer, and everything started to shift. Build tension. The children were maybe 10 or 11 years old. That age where they're old enough to know they're supposed to behave, but young enough that the impulse to misbehave is still extremely loud. A few of them drifted toward the guard's post, guided by a teacher who was doing her best to keep them organized and clearly losing. One boy, small, red-haired, wearing a coat that was slightly too big for him, pressed his face against the iron railing and stared directly at the guard. "He's not real," the boy said. Not meanly, just as a statement of fact, the way children say things. His friend leaned in. He's just not allowed to move." "Why?" "Because he's guarding the king. What if he needs the toilet?" Several adults nearby smiled. The guard didn't move a millimeter, but I was watching his eyes. And that's the thing, his eyes moved. Just slightly. Just enough that if you were paying attention, you could see he was tracking the children. Not with annoyance. With something else. Something that took me a while to name. Familiarity. Like he'd had this exact conversation 1,000 times, and there was something in it, the innocent logic of a child asking honest questions, that still reached him, even after all the years. Even through all the armor. The teacher gathered the children and moved them on. The crowd thinned a little. I stayed. I don't know why I stayed. I had nowhere particular to be. And there was something about the guard that I couldn't quite put down, the way you sometimes can't put down a book even when nothing dramatic is happening in it, because the writing has you and you don't fully understand how. 20 minutes passed. The amber light deepened. A pigeon landed near the guard's boot and stood there for a moment, completely unbothered, before wandering off. The guard's expression didn't change. Then, a woman appeared at the far end of the pavement. She was older, maybe 70, maybe a little more. She was wearing a green wool coat, and she walked with a slight lean to one side, not quite a limp, but close. She had a canvas shopping bag over one arm, and she was moving slowly, looking at the palace with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who wasn't there as a tourist. She walked right up to the gate, not to take a photo, not to point anything out to a companion. She was alone. She just stood there and looked at the guard in a very specific way, a way that was different from how anyone else had looked at him all afternoon. She looked at him the way you look at someone you know. The guard's eyes moved again, and this time something changed in them. Something small and sudden, like a light coming on in a window across the street. He knew her too. Climax, I edged a little closer, pretending to look at my phone. I know that's slightly embarrassing to admit, but I was completely gripped by this point, and I didn't want to miss whatever was about to happen. The woman didn't say anything at first. She just stood there with her shopping bag and her slight lean and her quiet attention looking at him through the iron fence. And he stood there perfectly still, perfectly composed, looking straight ahead. Then she said softly, so softly I almost missed it, "Hello, James." Not "hello, guard." Not "excuse me." Not some tourist question about visiting hours or photograph rules. James. His name. And I want to be precise about what happened next, because it was one of the most unexpectedly moving things I have ever seen in a public place. He didn't break composure in any dramatic way. He didn't smile or step out of position or say anything. He couldn't on duty. But something in his face shifted. Something deep and slow, the way a landscape changes when cloud cover breaks and actual sunlight reaches it for the first time in days. His jaw softened just slightly. His shoulders, which were already perfectly straight, seemed to settle differently, not slouching, not at all, but the kind of settling that happens when a person stops bracing themselves against something they've been bracing against for a very long time. His eyes moved to her face, and they stayed there. The woman, I found out her name was Margaret Whitfield, his mother, put her hand flat against the iron railing. Not dramatically, just placed it there, the way you might place your hand on a table to steady yourself. Her fingers were close to where he was standing. She didn't try to touch him through the railing. She didn't make a scene. She just put her hand there and looked at her son and said, "I brought you a sandwich from the baker's on Penn Street. The one you used to like. I've left it with the officer at the side entrance." That was it. That was all she said. Then she smiled at him, a small private smile, the kind that contains an entire history. And she picked up her shopping bag and she turned and she walked away slowly with her slight lean back down the pavement. The guard watched her go. He watched her until she turned the corner and disappeared. His eyes tracked her the whole way, steady and careful, the way he tracked everything. But it wasn't duty this time. It wasn't surveillance. It was something else entirely. I stood there with my useless phone in my hand, and I realized my throat had gone slightly tight, which was unexpected and a little embarrassing for a Tuesday afternoon in front of Buckingham Palace. A woman next to me, one of the American tourists with the big camera, had clearly witnessed the same moment. She lowered her camera without taking a photo, which felt like the right instinct. Some things you don't photograph. "Was that his mother?" she asked me quietly. "I think so," I said. She nodded slowly. She said his name. "Yeah. Does that happen often?" I looked at the guard. He was perfectly still again, perfectly composed. The amber light was fading now, going thin and blue at the edges the way it does when the sun drops below the roofline. He was back to facing forward, back to that fixed point in the middle distance. But his face was different. I don't know how to explain it exactly. He looked the same uniform, same posture, same unreadable expression that the tourists had been photographing all afternoon. But there was something in his face now that hadn't been there before. Like a room where someone has recently been, and you can feel the warmth still in the air. "I don't think it happens very often," I said. "No." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, That's a lot, isn't it? Standing out here, and nobody calls you by your name." I didn't have an answer for that, so I just nodded that I didn't leave right away. I know I probably should have. I had things to get back to, dinner to make, messages to reply, to all the ordinary machinery of a weekday evening. But I sat on the bench across the road instead, the one that faces the gates at an angle, and I watched the last hour of James Whitfield's shift without fully deciding to. There's something about witnessing a private moment in a public place that changes how you see the people around you. Before his mother arrived, James had been part of the background to me. Impressive, certainly even beautiful in that particular ceremonial way, but fundamentally a fixture, like the gates themselves, like the stone, something that was always there and therefore easy not to really see. Now I couldn't stop seeing him. I started noticing the small things. The way he occasionally shifted his weight, barely perceptibly, a millimeter at most, from his right foot to his left. The way he blinked slowly and deliberately, like even that was something he'd learned to do with discipline. The way the cold was starting to come through by 5 o'clock, and you could tell if you looked carefully enough by the very slight tension across his neck and jaw. He was cold. Of course he was cold. He was a person standing outside in late October in a heavy ceremonial uniform that was not, by any practical measure, designed for warmth. But he didn't show it. Not really. I thought about what his mother had said. "I brought you a sandwich. The one you used to like." Simple words. The kind of mother says. But there was a whole world inside those words, a world of Sunday afternoons, and knowing someone's order by heart, and making a trip across the city on a Tuesday in October just to leave something at a side entrance because you can't hand it to him yourself, because he is on duty, because this is his life now, and you have learned to love him inside the shape of it. I wonder how often she came, whether James knew she was planning to visit, or whether she just appeared sometimes, whether there was a quiet understanding between them. "Don't make a fuss, just come when you can. Say my name so I remember I still have one." At 5:15, the changing of the guard happened at his post. Another soldier appeared, moving with that same precise, unhurried purpose. A brief exchange. I was too far away to hear anything. It may have just been a formal acknowledgement, a handover of duty. And then James stepped back. He didn't relax the moment he stepped back. Not visibly. He turned, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the inner entrance with the same measured steps he used at the post. But just before he disappeared through the side passage, he paused. Just for a second. 1 second, maybe less. He looked back toward the corner where his mother had turned and disappeared. Then he went inside. The next morning, I went back the next morning. I'm not sure I can fully justify that decision. I told myself I was just walking through the park again, that it was on my way, that I needed the air. That was mostly not true. I arrived at the gates at about 9:30. There was a thin, gray drizzle coming down, the kind that isn't quite rain, but gets into everything anyway. The tourists were fewer than the day before. The weather kept the casual visitors away, but there was still a small group near the gate, a handful of people with umbrellas, and that particular brand of British determination to do tourist things despite absolutely discouraging conditions. The guard at the post was different from yesterday. Taller, broader in the shoulders. I felt a small, irrational disappointment. I wandered toward the side entrance, past the small booth where a palace officer stood behind glass. I don't know what I was planning to do. Probably nothing. But as I passed, I noticed, or thought I noticed, a brown paper bag sitting on the edge of the officer's counter, slightly crumpled, the kind of bag a local bakery uses. The kind of mother might put a sandwich in. The officer inside glanced up at me. I kept walking. I found a bench again and sat down. The drizzle had turned into actual rain by then, and I put up my hood and watched the gate and thought about what the American woman had said yesterday. That's a lot, isn't it? Standing out here and nobody calls you by your name. It was a lot. And the strange thing was that James didn't seem to experience it as deprivation exactly. He had chosen this. He came back from abroad, quieter than he'd left, and he had chosen this post, this gate, this uniform. There must be something in it for him that I couldn't see from a bench across the road. Some kind of order, maybe some kind of clarity. A place where the rules were absolute, and the role was clear, and you didn't have to explain yourself or manage your own face or figure out what to do with your hands. That I understood more than I expected to. Some people find silence peaceful. Some people find a fixed role liberating. Not everyone who is contained is trapped. But You still need someone to call you by your name occasionally. You still need that. What the other guard told me, this is the part of the story I hesitated about including because it came to me secondhand, and I want to be honest about that. But it felt important, so here it is. Later that week, I was at a pub near Victoria with a friend who works in events management and occasionally does logistics for ceremonial occasions near the palace. I told him what I'd witnessed on Tuesday. The mother, the name, the sandwich, the look on the guard's face. He listened without interrupting, which is unusual for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know, the blokes who do those posts, the long static positions, some of them have been there for years. And there's this thing that happens where visitors start to think of them as props. Like genuinely. People treat them like they're part of the architecture." I noticed that. I said, "One of the guys I work alongside at an event told me he'd done 3 years at one of the fixed posts, and in all that time, someone called him by his first name twice. Twice. In 3 years." He paused, and both times it was his mom. We sat with that for a moment. He said the strange thing wasn't the loneliness of it, my friend continued. The strange thing was how good he got at not being bothered by it. Like a muscle you train. You just stop expecting it. You stop needing it. And then someone says your name, and suddenly you realize you were still needing it the whole time. You just buried it very deep. I thought about James's face in that amber light. The way his jaw softened. The way his eyes settled on his mother and stayed there. "Yeah," I said. "That's exactly what it looked like." The thing about invisible people, I've been thinking about this a lot since that Tuesday. We have a habit, all of us, myself included, of making certain people invisible. Not cruelly, usually. Not intentionally. It just happens. The guard at the gate. The woman at the checkout. The man who fixes the roads at 6 in the morning. The nurse who brings the medication at 4 in the afternoon. We see the function, and we stop seeing the person underneath it. And the people in those roles often become very, very good at being invisible. They learn to occupy the function completely. They wear it like a second skin. And after enough time, even they can start to forget, not who they are exactly, but that being seen still matters to them. That having someone say your actual name still does something to you that you can't fully brace against, no matter how trained you are. James Whitfield stood at that gate for 11 years. Thousands of tourists, thousands of photographs, thousands of people who pointed at him and whispered to their friends and wondered if he was real. His mother came on a Tuesday afternoon with a sandwich from the bakery on Pennant Street, said his name through the iron railings, put her hand flat against the fence, and walked away. And for just a moment, one moment, brief and private, visible only if you were paying the right kind of attention, the function fell away, and there was just a person standing there. A cold Tuesday, an amber light, a mother's voice saying James. That was all it took. I didn't plan to dig further into this. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a journalist. I'm not someone who investigates things or follows threads. I'm just a person who takes walks when life feels heavy and sometimes stops and pays attention at inconvenient moments. But the story stayed with me. I kept coming back to James's face in that October light. The way it changed. The way his eyes held the corner where his mother disappeared long after she was gone. So I did something small. I asked around a little. A friend of a friend had done a stint with a ceremonial regiment in his 20s. Before a knee injury redirected him into something less demanding. I sent him a message, told him roughly what I'd seen, asked if he could give me any context. He was generous and thoughtful in his reply. He took a few days to get back to me, and when he did, the message was long. I won't reproduce the whole thing here, but there were parts of it that I haven't been able to stop thinking about. He told me that the psychological dimension of long-term ceremonial duty is something the military understands but doesn't publicize much. The training for fixed posts is extensive, not just physical conditioning, but mental conditioning. How to regulate your breathing when it's cold. How to manage your focus over a 2-hour standing shift. How to detach from provocation when tourists get too close or too loud or too strange. The detachment is the point. You need it to function. But detachment is a tool, not a state of being, and the difficulty the thing that nobody quite prepares you for, is that over time, the tool becomes harder to put down. You train yourself not to respond, he wrote, and eventually not responding becomes your default. And then the thing that was protecting you becomes the cage. I read that line 3 times. He also told me something specific about James, not from personal knowledge, he was careful to say, but from a conversation he'd had with someone who had served alongside him years before. James had been exceptional at the job from almost the first rotation. The kind of soldier who made the role look effortless. Unshakable. Commanding officers appreciated him. Fellow guards respected him. But he had become, over the years, the kind of person who other people describe by his function first. You'd say the tall one at the left post. You'd say the one who's been there forever. You wouldn't, without thinking, say James. Even his colleagues. Even people who liked him. He had achieved a kind of perfect invisibility inside perfect visibility. Seen by thousands every day. Known by nobody, except her. The sandwich this detail shouldn't matter as much as it does to me, but it does, so I'm including it. The sandwich from a bakery on Penn Street. That specific bakery. That specific order. I know that street. I walk down it. There's a small independent place on the corner that does old-fashioned filled rolls. Proper ones, the kind that have mostly disappeared from London now. It's not nearby. It's not on the way to anything in particular. Getting there from most parts of South or Central London involves 2 buses or a long walk or a combination of both. His mother came specifically from wherever she lives, went specifically to that bakery, bought specifically the thing he used to like, and then carried it to a side entrance at Buckingham Palace and left it with an officer because she couldn't hand it to him herself. She knew the procedure. She knew about the side entrance, which means she'd done this before. This wasn't a first visit. This wasn't an impulse. This was a routine. A quiet, private, unannounced routine that probably nobody else knew about. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't make a story of it. She just came and left the sandwich and said his name through the railing and walked home with her shopping bag and her slight lean and her green wool coat. That kind of love is very hard to write about without overwriting it. It doesn't need decorating. It's already everything it needs to be. A conversation. I imagined I'm going to be honest about this section. I didn't witness this conversation. I'm not claiming I did. But after everything I'd found out, I couldn't stop imagining how it might have gone. The first time Margaret Whitfield came to the gate and saw her son standing there as someone else. I think it probably happened early in his posting. He would have been younger, maybe 25 or 26. She would have come to see him proud, perhaps a little tearful. Not sad tears, just the kind that arrive when something important happens. And she would have stood at the gate and seen this person in the bearskin hat and the perfect uniform and the absolutely still face, and after a moment she would have recognized him, and she would have been slightly shocked by how much effort it took. How for a second, just a second, even she had seen the garb before she saw the sun. And I think afterwards she would have decided something. Quietly, without telling anyone. She would have decided that whenever she came, she would say his name. She would say it clearly and without fuss, just to remind him, and maybe to remind herself that the uniform was a thing he wore, not a thing he was. James. Not the guard. Not my son the guard. Just James. Because he was James before any of this. He was James in Shropshire, in a town where everyone used surnames, and the streets were quiet, and the light came in differently than it does in London. He was James when he was 10 years old, and he was James when he signed up at 18, and he was James when he came back changed and quieter and looking for something solid to hold on to. He was still James, and she wasn't going to let him forget that. The last afternoon, I went back to the gate one more time. This was about 3 weeks after that Tuesday. A different kind of day, cleaner and colder. The sky, the particular pale blue you only get in November when the air is completely clear. I almost didn't recognize him at first. Different angle, different light. But then I saw the way he held himself, and I knew. James was at the left post again. The crowd was thin. A few tourists, a couple with a pushchair who were clearly just cutting through, a young man who stood near the fence for a while taking detailed photos of the ironwork rather than the guard, which was unusual and somehow charming. I stood at the bench. I didn't stay long this time. I had somewhere to be, an actual somewhere, a genuine somewhere. But I watched for about 15 minutes. Nothing dramatic happened. No mother appeared. No curious children. No moments that broke through the composure. He just stood there, still and precise, in the pale November light, doing his job. But I saw him differently now. I saw the person who had come back from 2 difficult years quieter than he'd left and chosen this. Chosen the discipline and the structure and the silence, because sometimes when the world has been loud and violent and formless, what you need most is something that holds its shape. I saw the person whose colleagues described him by his post without quite meaning to. I saw the person who had learned, over years, not to need things, and who had been quietly undone on a Tuesday in October by the simple fact of someone saying his name. Not a dramatic undoing, not a collapse, just that softening, that slight, private shift in the face of a very trained, very contained man. His mother's voice in the amber light. Hello, James. That we talk a lot about the people who are seen too much, the ones who can't walk down a street without being noticed, who can't have a quiet moment because someone always has a camera. We talk about how hard that must be. We talk less about the ones who are seen constantly and known by nobody, who stand in the middle of enormous public attention and are invisible inside it, who train themselves year by year not to need what they still need. There's a guard at Buckingham Palace who can't remember the last time someone called him by his real name. His mother can. And once a week or so, she takes 2 buses and walks to a bakery on Penn Street and buys the sandwich he used to like and makes the rest of the journey to a side entrance and leaves it with the officer there and then walks around to the front gate and says his name through the railing. Just his name. That's all. James. And for a moment, just a moment, in the middle of all that stillness and ceremony and public invisibility, he is completely, quietly, entirely himself. That's not a small thing. That might be the whole thing.